the city was taken back by the regime. People know the violence of the Syrian regime. It knows that it has imposed death on an industrial scale in the prison, and yet they were not scared to go again and protest.
Hello, my name is Stanley Heller. Welcome to The Struggle. In just 2 months, there'll be a worldwide youth-led climate strike. How will teachers respond? This might be an indication. 1,200 members of the Massachusetts Education Association passed a resolution to send on to their national union calling for a national strike in support of a Green New Deal. The United Nations Executive Director on Climate has compared warnings on climate chaos to the shrieking of a smoke alarm. The MEA resolution asks, how can we continue to be role models for our students as the smoke alarm goes off? Deafening, piercing, if we fail to make every effort to usher them to safety. How will we face our grandchildren as the planet we left them goes up in flames? I'm sorry, we'll tell them. I was too afraid, too hopeless, too busy. September 20th would be a great day for action. More at globalclimatestrike.net. For more on climate issues, a section of the interview on Democracy Now! With journalist Dar Jamel.
For more, we go to Seattle to speak with Dar Jamel, the independent journalist and author of The End of Ice, Bearing Witness and Finding Meaning in the Path of Climate Disruption. His most recent piece for Truth Out headlined, Over 1/10 of the global population could lack drinking water by 2030. Dar, welcome back to Democracy Now! Talk about what you think is most important to understand now as we talk about the climate catastrophe that is enveloping us around the world.
Well, everything we just heard about what you're reporting with these ICE raids and the migrant crisis, the vast majority of these people are climate refugees. So to anyone in this country that thinks this crisis is not just on our doorstep, but we're living with the ramifications of it, that's just one layer of it. We can look around the world and just see right now before our very eyes evidence of how deep in this crisis we already are. It's not a future tense thing anymore. We are in it, and it is going to grow worse. But even right now, we saw regionally high temperature records across the Arctic for May. June was a record hot June for Alaska. July 4th, Anchorage saw 90 degrees. We're seeing feedback loops up there already kicked in, things like the tundra and the permafrost. The tundra specifically already becoming a net producer of carbon rather than a carbon sink. If we look down to the Antarctic, sea ice there is melting at record rates. 2014, according to a recent study, was a record high year of sea ice extent in Antarctica, the ice continent. In 3 years, by 2017, sea ice had reduced to its lowest level ever recorded, losing in that short 3-year period area of ice larger than the size of the country of Mexico. You were talking about the flooding in Asia. In addition to all the deaths you mentioned, in June in Mumbai, in one 48-hour period, they received their average monthly rainfall in just one 48-hour period. These things are happening right in front of us, and I think that's a very important part of this discussion that people need to understand and take in.
I want to turn to an interview last month Vice President Pence did, repeatedly refusing to say the climate crisis is a threat to the United States. He was interviewed by CNN's Jake Tapper.
Do you think human-induced climate emergency is a threat to the United States?
Well, what I will tell you is that we'll always follow the science on that in this administration.
The science says it is.
But what we won't do, and the Clean Power Plan was all about that, was hamstringing energy in this country, raising the cost of utility rates for working families across this country.
But is it a threat?
While other nations like China and India do absolutely nothing or make illusory promises decades down the road to deal with it. You know, the truth of the matter is, with the advent of natural gas, with the natural gas explosion that's developing, with clean coal technology, we're seeing a significant reduction in carbon emissions all across this country.
But is what people are calling a climate emergency, is it a threat? Do you think it's a threat? Man-made climate emergency is a threat?
I think the answer to that is going to be based upon the science.
Well, the science says yes. I'm asking you what you think.
There's many in the science that...
The science community in your own administration, at NOAA, at the DNI, they all say it's a threat.
Look, what the president has said, what we've said is that we are not going to raise utility rates.
So you don't think it's a threat, is all I'm saying. You don't think it's a threat.
I think we're making great progress reducing carbon emissions. America has the cleanest air and water in the world. We'll continue to use market forces.
We don't have the cleanest air and water in the world. We don't. Will you get back to me with some statistics to show it?
We're making progress on reducing carbon emissions.
There is the Vice President of the United States refusing to say climate change, that the climate crisis is a threat. Your response, Dar Jamal, as he says you have to look at the science.
Well, it's certainly not a surprise that these fossil fuel stooges of this administration would react exactly as Pence just did. I mean, they have their talking points, they have their marching orders, and they're just simply executing them. Meanwhile, if we look around the world at what's happening, again, the evidence is right in front of our face. You know, there's so many Native American stories that have talked about what happens when we do not live in harmony with Mother Nature and what happens if we get out of balance with that. One of them that I've written about and discussed is a story from the Pitt River Nation told by Darrell Wilson of the Pitt River Nation of northeastern California. And just as an example, he talks about a spirit force called Mis Misa that lives inside of Akuyet, the mountain that white people name Mount Shasta. And as long as humans listen very carefully and comport themselves correctly towards that mountain and listen to that spirit voice, nature will be kept in balance. But if people stop listening altogether, and if enough people stop listening, then that spirit force, Mis Misa, will go away and stop singing, and everything on the planet will go out of balance, and life therein vulnerable to extinction. And that's just one of countless stories and prophecies that warned of exactly what is upon us. We industrialized humans have stopped listening to the planet. We've stopped living in harmony, and now we're living in the time of reckoning of that. And unfortunately, if we look at all of the science, this is just the beginning. Everything that we're seeing, everything that everybody knows about the climate crisis to date has happened from just raising the temperatures 1.1 C above pre-industrial baseline levels. We are looking at temperature escalations in the coming years, not even talking about 2100, but even by 2050, that we could see several times that amount of increase, according to some of the most dire scientific predictions. And so sorry, go ahead, Amy.
I wanted to say a senior State Department intelligence analyst has recently resigned in protest after the Trump administration blocked parts of his written testimony to Congress about the dangers of climate change. In June, analyst Rod Schoonover was permitted to appear before the House Intelligence Committee to testify about the national security risk posed by global warming, but the White House barred him from submitting peer-reviewed scientific journal articles and intelligence reports as evidence to back his claims. Part of his censored testimony to Congress read, quote, "Absent extensive mitigating factors or events, we see few plausible future scenarios where significant, possibly catastrophic harm does not arise from the compounded effects of climate change." Catastrophic harm. But he wasn't allowed to say this to Congress. And I want to talk about some of those just catastrophic harms. One of those, which you most recently wrote about for Truth Out, over 1/10 of global population could lack drinking water by 2030. Tell us what you found.
Right. That's according to studies and warnings coming out of the country of India, where literally half the population of the entire country is on track if things do not change. And clearly things are changing, but unfortunately for the worse. But on the current trajectory, by 2030, we're talking barely over 10 years from right now, half the country of India is likely going to be facing not having enough drinking water. That, the bigger translation of that, that's 1/10 the global population. That's on top of people already today that lack enough drinking water, on top of the fact that the UN is warning of tens of millions more climate refugees just in the next decade alone. We talk about these catastrophic effects. One of these is children in cages. It's what the whole first half of the show was just on. I mean, these changes are right in front of our face. And so when the Trump administration talks about, we're going to use our scientists and we're going to rely on science, well, this is a fossil fuel lobby talking point that they're following. If we look at all of the other science around the world, and even save the science, if we just use our own eyes and look at these events unfolding right in front of us, it's very, very clear. Now, Amy, when I published my recent book, this is the result of 9 years of intensive climate reporting and a meticulous research. And I went into the field and I went to the front lines with leading scientists and saw with my own eyes what is happening. And everything that I found is right there. And I didn't even know how right that I had it. And what we're seeing playing out in front of us, though, now is so accelerated and so much faster than I thought, even when the book came out, that I am shaking my head on a daily basis as I write these ongoing climate dispatches. And so it is a situation where this is likely my last journalism book, because on this crisis, the evidence is in front of us. We keep reporting the same stories over and over. We just keep adjusting the numbers upwards. And like we always used to hear when we were reporting from Iraq about how bad things were becoming there, today is better than tomorrow, and that certainly applies to the climate crisis. June was the hottest June ever recorded on the planet. The last 5 years are the hottest 5 years in history. This is the trajectory that we're on, and these numbers are only going to continue to increase.
And then talk about who it affects. A UN expert has warned we're on track for climate apartheid, where wealthy people can pay their way out of the consequences of climate devastation, while others will face hunger, conflict, mass displacement. The new report is by Philip Alston, the UN Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty and Human Rights, concluding the UN and the larger human rights community has been complacent in the planet's impending disaster, and that even if current global emissions targets are met, millions will be impoverished. Poorer nations expecting to bear at least 75% of the costs of climate change, even as the poorer half of the world's population generates just 10% of global emissions. Dar.
Right. I believe the numbers from that report are 120 million more people driven into poverty by climate impacts by just 2030. And that's on top of the people that are already there. Again, the evidence, you just spent 30 minutes reporting on the evidence and talking to these poor people who are fleeing their countries because they do not have food. They cannot grow crops. The support in their own countries to help them through this crisis, to help them find another way of living, even just basic necessities like food, shelter, and health care, is not there. These people are risking their lives to go to a completely different country to try to find help. And think about it. Here in the U.S., so many of us live in this bubble where we, at least for now, have enough food and water and something like health care if we're lucky. How bad would things have to get for each one of us to leave everything that we know and love, places where we've spent large parts of our lives, and go to a completely new foreign country, especially one that we know hates us and rejects us, and the government is demonizing us and going to great lengths to keep us out, and if we manage to get in, is going to terrorize us and kick us out. That's how bad it is for people living in poverty already.
Well,
Jamal's article says 700 million people will be without water in just 11 years. I do not think they'll just take it lying down. Rebellion against extinction. Protests have erupted in Puerto Rico following FBI arrests of 2 associates of Governor Ricardo Rosselló for corruption, and for the publication of hundreds of pages of Rosselló's chat room threats against journalists and political rivals. and his vicious remarks against women and gays. Of course, this all takes place on the background of 5,000 dead in Puerto Rico from Hurricane Maria and the inability of Rosselló and Trump to restore electricity to the island. It took them 11 months. There are many, many calls for Rosselló's resignation. The people were met with riot batons and tear gas. Someone apparently set fire to trash in a mobile trash container that was between police and protesters. On July 17th, tens of thousands protested outside the governor's mansion. You probably know about the Chinese government putting 1 million Uyghur Chinese of the Muslim religion into re-education camps, which some are calling concentration camps. It's even illegal for Chinese to give their children Muslim names. Disgracefully, leaders of many Muslim countries are turning their backs on the Uyghurs. Humorist Art Buchwald once nailed the situation. He said there's really only two religions, the rich and the poor. Israel's education minister was in the news again this week. He claimed it's possible to make someone ungay through conversion therapy, and that he's done it himself. Even Netanyahu had to distance himself from this absurdity. Now the last minutes of Yasser Munif's talk in New Haven about Syria, centering on the conquest by Assad of Aleppo, and also his answer to a question about what's happening in Aleppo today.
This is the consequence of barrel bombs and the asymmetrical destruction of Aleppo. Again, there is almost overlap between the almost intact regions of the Syrian regime. And by the way, those are maps from the UN study group, and those are the affected areas of the opposition. The orange ones are the most affected, and the yellow are less affected. And here are the strikes against hospitals, almost completely in the opposition region. And so what happened as a result is that most of the life in Aleppo, or a good chunk of the life in Aleppo, moved to the underground. And people started moving their activities. They created underground playground, movie centers, schools, cultural centers, libraries, medical centers, and so on, all underground. And so there are all these striking, shocking pictures of destructions and rubbles and ruins, on the level of the ground. And then you go underground, and there is entire life. So here you have some of the tunnels that were dug by the opposition. Some of them were used for military purposes. Others were used by to create life beneath the ground. And the last picture I want to show is this is hospitals and different institutions. The last picture is, I think, symbolic and telling. It's a crater that was, can we go to? I think this is a representative of what I was trying to convey, the confrontation between the politics of death and the politics of life. Here you can see a crater created by a barrel bomb, and it was transformed into a swimming pool or a pond where kids were swimming. Thank you.
You know, none of us talked about what happened to Raqqa. You know, here is a place that the ISIS took over, and the U.S. bombed the heck out of it. And Amnesty says 1,600 civilians were killed. And as far as I know, we're not doing anything to restore Raqqa, even though it's still occupied by people allied with the U.S. Anyway, one thing we certainly could do in penance is to let Syrians in, even if we didn't think of doing it as a humanitarian thing. Keep Russian airliners outside the United States, Aeroflot. I mean, their pilots bomb these people in Syria, and then their military career is over, then they go fly for Aeroflot, go into JFK and O'Hare and so on.
So the Syrian regime was able to take back the city in 2016, end of 2016. As I mentioned, the Syrian regime was concentrating its forces on Aleppo and Damascus, the two major cities in Syria. And at some point, it was thinking that if there is segmentation or fragmentation of the territory, at least it would have those two major cities. Since then, there's been protest by the loyal pro-Assad people because nothing has been resolved. There is a lot of unemployment. People don't have access to food. There is shortages of fuel and bread. The militias are roaming the city and looting and taking over houses. And there is the reconstruction, between quotation mark. I mean, the language is just like lethal. When they talk about reconstruction, what they mean is looting and taking over entire neighborhood, displacing people and preventing them from coming back, taking their property and selling it to entrepreneurial Aleppan who were loyal to the Syrian regime and so on. So there is a lot of discontent. People are very upset, and I think this is why it's important to think about the revolt as a long process. And I think there will be a break for some time, and there will be the opposition is to a certain extent weakened, but there will be a revival of the revolt. We've seen that in the south. We've seen that in the north. We've seen that in Aleppo. In Dar'a, there were protests. I mean, the city was taken back by the regime. People know the violence of the Syrian regime. It knows that it has imposed death on an industrial scale in the prison, and yet they were not scared to go again and protest and bring the flag of the Syrian revolution and so on and so forth. So I think what is really important right now is to prevent the Syrian regime from reimposing that silence. That Syria shouldn't go back to the kingdom of silence. And one of the important things is not to think just about what is happening on the ground, but also what is happening at the level of discourse, meaning that we should break the siege around the idea that the revolution is over, the revolution has been defeated, and so on, and build alliances, raise awareness, tell people that this is not over, tell people that what's happening in Syria is connected to what's happening in Sudan and Nigeria, and there is an order that is over, and people need our support. But we need a different type of anti-war movement. The anti-war movement that many people are talked about has become a monster. They only care about the US wars, and they don't pay enough attention to the violence of the Arab regime, to the Arab dictators, which is the source of most of the violence in the region.
And one comment on Aleppo. Despite the regime taking back most of the city, northern Aleppo is still actually in opposition hands. And one thing that was kind of inspiring I found out is people, when the regime abandoned these areas and left them under siege, these local councils would step up and kind of act as de facto governments. And there's some variations. Some of them were just kind of ruthless councils that were in survival mode. Some of them really stuck to their democratic processes. But I noticed that the local council of Aleppo, or one of them, was passing secret ballots even after the battle was over, and they elected a woman to lead their council. This was about a year and a half ago. So there is still opposition trying to govern in secret, but they're in hiding. And I saw this group, they got a few pictures out to civilian media, explained their situations, and went back to hiding because they stay out too long, they'll be killed.
Speaking of Aleppo, we'll link to a section of Democracy Now! On Friday the 18th. It talks about a new film that's appearing in the U.S. next week. It's about what people in Aleppo sacrificed in their years-long struggle against Assad. The film is called For Sama. That's our program for today. See you next week at this time. I'm Stanley Heller for The Struggle.